So I grew up in a Roman Catholic milieu, some of you know this, in which the question, do you have a vocation, primarily meant one thing. The question, do you have a vocation, and those of you who are in the club know this, primarily meant that were you called to the religious life as a priest or a nun? Were you called to give your life in service to God and to the church? Now, occasionally in the parochial school that I attended, particularly around 7th and 8th grade, we would have guest speakers just kind of magically appear in our class who would speak to the boys about the priesthood and the girls about being a nun. Did anyone else have this experience? Okay, my heart goes out to you. The nuns would sometimes talk to us about having a vocation. And we would sometimes pray in the church for more vocations. The expectation seemed to be that this was a necessary question for any young man or young woman to ask themselves at some point, and particularly during adolescence. The pressure felt somewhat subtle until it wasn't. Let me give an example of a not too subtle approach to popping the question. I don't know how exactly it happened, but I remember one summer meeting in the parking lot of the church, which was also the playground for our Catholic school during the week. That day we piled into cars with other boys from other parishes on our way to what was called a summer camp. I was looking forward to the trip away. I particularly liked the role of helping to navigate with the map book, the triptych that the driver had provided. And on the dashboard, there was even a rolling ball compass that would indicate if we were going north or northeast or west. We might call it a prehistoric GPS. So when we arrived after a 6-hour drive, the camp, as it turned out, was actually on the grounds of the Holy Cross Preparatory Seminary in Dunkirk, New York. It was a beautiful sight, wonderful campus, right on the shores of Lake Erie. We were to be there a week. Now, we did have camp activities, sports and games and singing around a big campfire, and we also attended Mass every morning and evening. There's a lot of folk masses at that time with songs by Bob Dylan, the Mamas and the Papas, Tom Waite, and other singers popular at the time. We sang peace songs and civil rights songs, and some mornings we attended simple classes, which I actually liked because I probably was better at class than it was at hitting a home run. One class I recall was on science and religion and the various views of the origin of the world. It was actually fascinating to me at the time. It was the first time I'd heard about the Big Bang Theory. Now, there were a lot of us there from several states, and let's face it, it was a recruiting tactic for discerning who among us would be soldiers of Christ. You see, preparatory seminaries actually existed back then as places where young men could attend this specialized high school and get a taste of what seminary life would be like. And I have to admit that it was an odd summer camp experience. It was like a farm league for seminaries, I suppose. As my religious views changed by the time I was 17 years old, and as I matured and became clearer about my own identity and beliefs, I no longer imagined I would have any interest in a vocation to the Roman Catholic priesthood. Yet the idea of having a vocation, of having a calling, is one that has stayed with me. Calling has meaning for me, even though my understanding of the varieties and the sources of this calling have changed considerably since then. As you know, calling has often been associated in the past with primarily a religious calling, as in a calling to ministry, and the call has often been considered to have happened through divine communication. I do feel called to my work, which means I feel devoted to this ministry, to my ministry in this congregation, and on my best days, I feel my ministry both utilizes and stretches my capabilities and possibilities as a person. But as you know, there are many secular, quote-unquote, books on calling that exist now. I wish for any one of us a sense of calling, of vocation. When I think of calling and the recognition of calling in any one of us, I think of these verses that you may know from Marge Piercy in her poem, To Be of Use. She writes, "The people I love the best jump into work head first without dallying in the shallows and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black, sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well, the thing worth doing is well done, has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. My hope is that we all have experiences like this at some point or sometimes in our lives. Experiences when we as individuals or as part of a group of individuals come together for some endeavor that uses us, spends us, so that the connection between who we are, what we do, seems to flow in one exquisite dance. And we all know that our calling or our vocation is not a question that is answered once and for all. No, we know that there are many seasons of our living and that we may find ourselves at any chapter at any time, reconsidering now what we're called to be and to do. We also do some reconfiguring along the way and some rethreading. Julia Cameron's book, It's Never Too Late to Begin Again, is one of those recent guides that invites people in midlife or retirement to redefine their lives during a time in which they might enjoy more freedom and also find that same freedom daunting as they ask, now what am I called to do? You following me here? Okay, a little breathing helps. One writer offered this analogy about the struggle and the challenge it sometimes is to find and to discover and to recover and to live out our calling. She writes, you can think of your calling as a car that hasn't already been built. You just have to dig it out from under a pile of garbage, activate the engine, and clear the road and go. Some understand calling not so much as a choice, but a destiny, like the perennial acorn that is destined to become an oak tree. In this view, we do not simply have a vocation. Vocation has us. James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, who in his book, The Soul's Code, in Search of Character and Calling, offers this particular perspective. A calling may be postponed, avoided, intermittently missed. It may also possess you completely. Whatever, eventually it will win out. It makes its claim. The call does not go away. Some of you may identify with this understanding of your own calling. Now, whether or not you agree with Hillman's sense of destiny, the destiny of our calling, there are ways in which our sense of calling often expands and continually lures us. I do resonate with Matt Bloom, who wrote, "A calling is meaningful because it connects a person to a virtuous ideal, something bigger and more important than just personal success. Through a calling, a person is able to express his or her truest and most authentic self in and through their work." I also resonate with some of David Spangler's view, who says, "We may receive in our lives the calls that come from the deepest places in ourselves. They are not summonings, but are more like awakenings. They call us to attention." I'm sure any one of us can speak of times when we were awakened by a cause or an interest. Helen described the Green Circle project that she was part of. That felt to me like an awakening to a call, to a cause that seemed to unfold and develop and engage others. I believe that a calling can be deeply personal, can feel like a destiny, can feel like what we are meant to do in this life. And yet I also think that a calling often points outside of ourself as well. Therefore, my favorite understanding of vocation is from Frederick Buechner, who famously wrote, "Vocation is the place where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Maybe calling is always this kind of dynamic that occurs in the alchemy between our own life and the life of the world that surrounds us. Maybe calling is and will always be a synergy between character, who we are, context, where we are, and kairos, the moment that we are in. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, the writer, the author of the book known as Man's Search for Meaning, honed his own understanding of vocation from his observations of those who survived the ordeal of Auschwitz. He recognized that those who had survived created a meaning in a situation that might otherwise destroy them with despair. Frankl himself had an important manuscript that was sewn into his overcoat at the time that he was captured and arrested and taken to a camp. It was his life work. And when he arrived at the camp, that coat was the first thing that they took away from him. It was at that point he knew that he needed to dedicate himself to that work, that he needed to compose in his own heart and mind what his experiences were in that brutal concentration camp. Frankl, a psychiatrist who became the originator of logotherapy, declared that we should not ask ourselves what we want from life. Instead, he argues, we should ask ourselves, what does life want from us? What does life want from us? I think it can be a mixture of the two, don't you? But to have that other dimension of not just focusing on self, but also focusing on the world around us, again, I think creates a synergy in which vocation can emerge. Frankl says there's a difference between the call from within and the call from outside. It's the difference between ambition and vocation. The former comes from the self, the latter from something outside and larger than the self. So for Frankl, self-actualization wasn't enough. Self-transcendence was also necessary. As we approach the Passover celebration this week, I'm going to suggest that we could reflect on the universal pattern of Moses' call, a central character here during the Passover week, and ask ourselves how it could help us understand about our own approach to being called and to serve a cause outside of ourselves. I think there are patterns in the Moses story of calling that can help us understand our own life calling, whatever our age. Did you hear me say that? Whatever our age? Yes? Okay. You know the story. Moses, while keeping the flocks at his father-in-law's, noticed that there's a small bush on fire, but it's not consumed by the flame. Rabbis have often pointed out that Moses could only have noticed this particular feature of the bush by stopping and choosing to pay close attention to the scene over a period of time. As the text says, God did not call out to Moses until God saw that Moses had turned aside to see, to stay with, and to notice what was happening with that bush. According to the story, it is only when Moses brings his full awareness to the situation before him that God calls, Moses, oh Moses. And it's then that Moses replies, Hineni, I am here. Likewise, our own sense of call, of being awakened to calling at this point in our lives can only occur if, like Moses, we're able to turn our full attention to how life is addressing us in this moment, so that we too can respond. Hineni, I am here. Let's try that. Hineni, I am here. Try that a few times this week and see if your words actually match your experience. I am here. I am here. So using this pattern of Moses' calling to I would say that discerning our own calling at any particular moment might also require this first movement of attentiveness. To even begin to hear our calling at this moment, at this season of our life, is to attend to what is calling us now. not some previous decade or decades, but what is calling us now. We might ask ourselves, how is life addressing me in this moment? What is life calling me to be or to do? Indeed, Richard Bowles, the author of that classic career guidance book, it's been out, speaking of decades, it's been out for decades. What color is your parachute? He advises his readers to pay attention as they walk through their everyday life, to pay attention, he says, to what calls you, what causes you to pause, what awakens your interest, or your passion, or what awakens empathy in you. Try that this week. Just notice what it is that awakens you, that calls to you, that stirs your own sense of empathy. Now, whether you are seeking a career now or not, I think that this first step can still serve us as each of us awaken within our life again and again. Now, the second movement in the account of Moses' calling is that of wondering. As you know, in Moses' story, in the story of Moses, he engages with the presence, speaking to him through the burning bush. Moses asks of that presence, "Who should I say is calling me?" The response, as it is recorded, is, "I am what I am." Or some translate it to say, "I am becoming what I am becoming." I like to think that Moses' willingness to be in wonder allowed him to also hear that same voice within himself. I am what I am. I will become what I will become. Likewise, rather than our immediately turning aside, rather than allowing skepticism to take over, as it sometimes do when we're close to a calling, we might cultivate that quality of wonder, to engage it, to enter into it, to interact with it, to allow ourselves to listen long enough to what we are actually experiencing, to listen to the situation that is capturing our attention, to be in that state of wonder about what is happening rather than to draw quick conclusions. And then there's that third movement of developing a communal consciousness that's beyond just ourselves. In the Moses story, you know, he's being called to step up as an individual, to move into his emerging destiny, but to do so for the sake of something bigger, what Frankl would call something outside of himself, what Frederick Buechner would call the world's deep hunger. For Moses, this means accepting his role to do something about the plight of the Israelites, their liberation, to empathize with their struggle. And likewise, the question for us is, for the sake of what am I responding to this call? Who am I being called to serve? And then finally, in this pattern of Moses' calling, I think there's another message for us as well. It's the message of humility. You see, Moses doubted himself. He didn't want to take on that role. He recognized all of his flaws, but he came to understand that he could still do something without being perfect. Likewise, what What ways do many of us not act on what we're called to do because we have a self-doubt that freezes us? I mean, Moses claimed, I'm not a leader. I don't know how to do this. I'm a stutterer. No one will listen to me. Your list might have different items on it, but it's still the same process. Yet he said yes to being a liberator of the Israelites anyway. So this pattern of attentiveness, of wonder, of communal consciousness, and humility can help us claim our own vocation in the ways that will allow us to live it out, each in our own way. The same pattern, I think, works on the congregational level if we can truly ask ourselves the questions to help us discern a call. What is calling our attention, and how attentive are we? Which voice do we tend to hear, the voice of skepticism or the voice of commitment to the possibility that we can notice when we take time to wonder about what is before us? For the sake of whom do we accept our calling? And what are our capacities? What capacities do we need to develop? And what capacities might we need to call upon to be faithful to our call? Next week, when we tell the story of what some of our members in our congregation have been doing in collaboration with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee to respond to the call of a local family seeking asylum, I see that each of these steps have been involved in that process.